I'm Stefan Baumann. I would like to invite you on a special journey. A journey of exploration in a magical place. A place of mystery, adventure, intrigue, and where art and history collide. A place where the old masters found their inspiration and enlightenment. And that enlightenment they shared with the world forever. This September, experience the thrill of adventure in my plein air painting workshop in Tuscany. Together we will capture Florence's sublime effects of light and witness forever for yourself the beauty that is Tuscany. Everything you need to know about this extraordinary opportunity to paint in Italy can be found on my website at www.stefanbaumann.com. The great thing about pastels, though, is that you do get the color that you want, and you have to have all the pastels. You'll go in there and you'll take yellow ochre and you kind of put the yellow ochre in. But the thing is, it's kind of like you've got this whole array of colors, and you've got purple and mauve and blue and green and yellow and orange and all this stuff. And so you put in the yellow, and then you just kind of like mindlessly just kind of stick colors in. And so you tend to put purples in, where oil painters, you have to think, oh, I got to mix another color. And so it's different. It's got, you kind of like can just throw color in on top of color on top of color, and you can get it. That's why pastels are so actually kind of fun and easy to do. They're not hard. I mean, I always kind of gauge it like this, and I'm going to get a lot of trouble for this, but basically, oil painting is the hardest of all the mediums.
Some of the pastels.
Oh no, watercolors are down below. And the way I know that, almost every art show you go to, you'll rarely see any really good oil paintings, because they're hard. And then acrylics are like right up there too, because a lot of the acrylic artists are trying to make their acrylics look like oils. So it's like double whammy. They're like, oh well, I have to paint really fast, and I don't like the smell of oils, but I use acrylics and all this stuff. But you really, they're just as hard, if not harder. And then I would say harder, because you have to kill that color. And then I would say the easier one then would be pastels. And then I would say the easiest out of all of them are watercolors.
I think that's the hardest one.
No.
Because you've got to plant.
No, you don't. No, you don't. My watercolor students on my coaching classes, no, the problem is with the watercolors is that they have this perception that they can't fix anything, and it's like, oh, come on. It's like,
a traditional watercolors never uses white.
No, you got to keep the paper.
Right.
You know, but the thing is,
like
artists but see, well, kind of, it's a little different thinking. But basically, if you can do a good wash, you could be a watercolorist. It's not that hard. And when you go to an art show, you'll see a lot of good watercolors, because they're not that hard. If you actually do watercolors, I have students that have gone from oils, which they couldn't wrap their head around, and very simply got into watercolors. And my problem with watercolors is that they don't get dark enough fast enough. So my students that I teach watercolors with, man, I get them to start putting in dark. Because I tell them, I said, you know, you want to paint watercolors like Sargent does. And you think Sargent sat around and did a little whitewash, and then went a little darker, and then a little darker? No! He had enough knowledge, and this is the whole thing. If you master oil painting, watercolors are easy. Because then you know values, temperature, color, saturation, and you can go in and mix up a really dark color and put it in where it's supposed to be and have the confidence of where it goes. But see, they don't teach watercolor like that. You'll go down to the senior center and you'll have some gal that read some book on watercolor and maybe watched 2 videos, and she's now the teacher, and she'll go, okay, now remember the paper is really valuable. So it's very expensive. You don't want to make any mistakes. Now start off, remember the whites. You've got to keep it, so put some mastic on because you don't want to touch your whites. And then you want to slowly work little grays and stuff. And if you've got a room full of retirees that are in their art class for the first time, that might be a good way to go. But I can tell you, if somebody who knows how to master watercolors, they get in there and they go in the darks, and you just have to kind of know how to manipulate it. If you make a mistake, they go, oh, but if you make a mistake, you can't fix it. It's like, you just go darker. The thing is with watercolor, it can get darker and darker, and the biggest problem with most watercolors is that they're not dark enough to begin with. And the thing is, the problem... Yeah, well, no, there's not. Watercolor can be awesome. I mean, if you look at Sargent's watercolors, they're amazing. But if you have watercolor, you start putting watercolor in, and you start going darker and darker. But the reality is that the paper will only eventually just stop absorbing. It just says, I'm not taking any more color. And if you don't go in dark enough to begin with, you can never get it really that dark that you need. And so if Sargent was going to do some watercolors on location, he'd sit and mix a black and with very little water and very thickly paint onto that paper and get that area black, and then kind of work just like an oil painting, black, lighter, lighter. But if you don't have the knowledge of an oil painting and understand color and value, it's almost impossible to kind of conceive that. You know, if you just start off with watercolors, and if you have a couple of these teachers that go, now just remember, don't make it too dark. You know, it's like you'll never get that feeling. So I always tell people it's like learning to play the piano. If you want to learn an instrument and you're not sure what instrument, learn the piano, because almost everything that you can learn, you can put into any instrument. In fact, most pieces of music are actually written on a piano. So it's a really good foundation. If you want to learn how to do really good watercolors, start off with oil first. Learn oil first. If you learn oil first, you don't need to learn acrylics, you don't need to do pastels, you don't need to learn watercolor. If you learn acrylics, you have to still learn how to do oils. If you learn pastels, you still have to learn watercolor, acrylic, and oils. And if you learn watercolors, you still have to learn all the others. And so the best way of learning to do watercolors is master oil painting. Then you have you're not fearful of darks, and you're not fearful of change, and you have some idea of pure color, you know, the richness of color, what it looks like. Sargent did fantastic, beautiful watercolors, and if you look throughout history, you'll see that the really good, strong watercolors all started off as oil painters.
Can you get the watercolors, can you get them as bright as you can pastel or oil?
Oh yeah, you can. You can make. I've seen watercolors where you swear that they were oil paintings from a distance. But the thing is, you're not going to get there inching it up, because eventually the paper goes no more. It just doesn't want to take any more color. So you have to start off with really good color to start off with. But if you have this kind of soft way of getting to your end product, you'll never get that color in there. And you'll probably end up muddying it up because you're putting in layer after layer after layer. I mean, there's nothing more beautiful than taking a gorgeous, rich yellow ochre or raw sienna and or even a burnt sienna tone in watercolor and put it a good, strong layer on top of paper one time. It just illuminates. But if you work up to that, it ain't going to happen. So, you know, you kind of have to think, okay, I want this to be a gorgeous color, I need to work towards that. So I just think that watercolor has a lot of value to it. Pastels have a lot of value to it. They still don't, I mean, like I always say, is that we don't go to Europe to go see the pastels. We don't go to Europe to see the watercolors. We go to Europe to see the oil paintings. We go see Turner and even Sargent. If you go, you don't go, I'm going to go to Boston and see Sargent's collection of watercolors. It's like, no, you go you want to see an original oil painting, because that's where it's really exciting. Yeah, it's like they're just like absolutely incredible. But Sargent painted beautiful watercolors. And the thing is that with Sargent and some of the other watercolors, they'll work on a whole big sheet, not just in this confined area. And then when they go to frame it, they'll actually take matting and they'll move it around and crop the composition, which is also a way of kind of working with your watercolors too, because if you think about watercolors, you can't correct them hugely. You can, if you get kind of something wrong, you can adjust it and you can fix it by making everything darker. But let's just say you start working on a bridge, and then you get halfway through and you go, oh, I wish that bridge were 3 inches over this way. And you have all of that stuff showing through. If you're not really good, it's hard to get rid of that. But if you work on a large sheet of paper, you can put the bridge in, you can put in this and all the other things, and then you can, at the end, go in and kind of crop it down to what you want. And then that way you can kind of assure that you don't have to pay attention to that composition for that size of paper and everything. There are some watercolors that Sargent did that the museums have actually gone in and given plastic plexiglass mats on. So you can actually see where the original was cropped down, where he chose, but you could actually see all the other part of the watercolor that he chose not to have. And so it's kind of interesting to see that. So that way you don't have to worry about having your central focal point within the middle third and be really anal about that. You just kind of put it all in, and then in the cropping stage, and a lot of oil painters work that way too, like Richard Schmidt. He works on a large sheet of canvas attached to a piece of cardboard. And they just kind of go out and paint it. And then in the cropping stage, they crop it down and then they have the canvas stretched to that size. And you can get some really bizarre sizes that way, but you can be really careful. And it makes kind of logic sense to do that. It's just easier to kind of crop your painting down to be right, because it's hard sometimes when you're painting and you know, all of you have gone through this. It's like you're working on it and all of a sudden you realize, wow, that center focal point is a little low, or it's a little to the left or to the right. The great thing with oil painting is you kind of wipe it off and push it over. But with watercolor, you don't have that option.
So you don't do a lot of cropping with your oils?
No, well, the part of being an oil painter and you're working not on a canvas, or if you're working on a canvas, you kind of have to keep in mind your golden means and your dividers, your law of thirds, all that stuff. You kind of have to keep it in mind with the canvas itself. And so if you're having knowledge about composition, you can kind of place it. If you have a lot of practice in doing it, you can kind of foresee that. But you can also push it around. One of the biggest problems with oil painters is that it's the exact opposite of watercolors. Because with watercolors, you kind of have to have some plan, and that's the hardest thing. It's like you kind of have to have some plan so that you do preserve your areas of central focal point and light. You do keep them transparent and light, even if you are doing a large sheet and you're going to crop it, you still have to kind of preserve the area of light while you're working on it, or put some mastic on it, which is the beginner way of doing it. But that's kind of how you start that. With an oil painting and that's on a canvas, you have to see that thing there. And the biggest problem with artists is oil painters is that they don't perceive the finished product. So with a watercolor, you perceive what it's going to be, and so you kind of have to plan it. Oil painting, it's like, oh, I'll have it here. If it's not there, I'll push it over there. I mean, when I work with my coaching students over the phone and I'm looking at their painting, I go, so, what were you thinking? And they'll go, well, my center focal point started off to be this, but then halfway through I decided to be this, and then I thought it would be this, and now this. And so I say, you weren't really thinking through this whole thing. And they're like, and you look at the painting and it just kind of gets flat. If you don't have that center focal point, regardless of pastel or watercolor or oil painting or acrylics, if you don't have that center focal point in mind, if you're not gauging your painting that way, you can just get really lost. So by gosh, by golly, you know. So Oil painters, they push it around. So when you start off a painting, you got to say, this is what I want to keep. And that's what I listen for when I do my phone coaching. I want to hear my students go, my central focal point is this. And I say from the beginning, go, yeah, I set it up to be that way. And it's all in the setup. There's not a lot of secret to painting at all, especially when you're doing still lifes and things, or portraits. Because you can kind of adjust and do all that stuff. I used to be really, really bad at putting stuff together for still life. Because I just go, well, what do you put in? I thought it was all about objects. But literally I could throw anything onto a shelf and just light it right. And it will turn out. There's some things you have to kind of think about. You don't want to have all the same shape. And you want to kind of have 3 items and not 4, and little things like that that you do for a composition. But for the most part, if you set it up, then you don't have half the guessing that you have at the end.
When you do your big paintings, do you do preliminary sketches or values and stuff?
If I can throw anything onto a shelf, I can change, and you see me do this just even by adjusting the light right onto the painting. If I could throw anything onto a shelf and then light it, I can pull a composition out just through the lighting. And you saw this morning when I was setting up. It was like, remember how I was just adjusting the light and playing with it? That's all it takes, is having a lighting effect, because the center focal point should be an effect, not a thing. And so when you kind of get that, then you set it up that way, there's no guessing. And that doesn't mean your painting has to be dark and you have to have this huge heavy contrast thing. You just want to make sure that you have an area that's definitely more lit. Now, when you go outdoors, sometimes you go out there and there's no sunlight.
Or it's all lit.
Or it's all lit. And that's where practicing it inside matters. So like if you're inside practicing how to create a highlight on stuff, and you know how to do that, you know how to work your temperatures, you know how to work your lighting, you know how to work your shadows, you know how to work your value, then you can sit there and be out there midday. And I've done this before, even with my TV show. And when I start, I have to kind of foresee where the light's going to be while I'm painting, but it shifts every 7 minutes. So at some point you have to say, this is my center focal point. And you'll just look out there and just gauge what makes sense. And you just choose it. And hopefully if you know how to work with lights and shadows, it's the same way as moving this around. This kind of helps because it's actual a physical thing. But if I choose, remember it's all about choose. If I choose to have a center focal point be a certain area, then I have to know how to make that happen. I have to know how light works onto that. And all that stuff you learn from painting from life indoors. You don't learn it from doing photographs and all that stuff. You learn it by just manipulating and learning to do the light. Everybody who I work with in my classes and with my coaching, that's basically the foundation for everything that we do, is how the light falls onto things. But set it up first so it's that way. Now with the watercolors, you kind of have to be even hyper on that. Because with oil painting, sometimes I get busy and I go, oh shit, I covered my central focal point.
You do a lot of stuff that's outdoors, like your parks and your animals and big pictures and vista scenes and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
You can't set that up.
No, you can't. That's just it. You can't go outdoors, like Molly says, you can't go outdoors and it's, you can't tell God. I can. I do.
Yeah, I've been reading about you. I do Bible study.
Yeah, it's kind of like, I moonlight giving Bible study, yes. So in fact, it was really funny because I used to take my classes around to the different national parks. And we'd go, if you can imagine having 12 to 15 cars, all driven by my students who are mostly women, driving without their husbands, usually 2 or 3 people in each car. And this was back when we didn't have cell phones, so we were all hooked up by CBs. And I would take them from San Francisco to Yellowstone
Oh, my goodness.
in a caravan. I did that for 17 years. I'd gone to Yellowstone every fall, and we went to the Grand Canyon every spring for 17 years. I'd count how many times I'd been there in a caravan situation with anywhere between 12 and 20 people and just as many cars. CBs, so not everybody would be in CBs, but we'd have my head car in front, and then we always had somebody at the end with CB, and then a couple of people in between, and we would talk amongst each other. And a lot of these women have never been away from their husbands, and they would go on groups like this, never had driven that far, and I would just take, I was 20, 21, it's like I wasn't really that smart. What if someone had a heart attack or something?
I can imagine some of the conversations you heard from those about
Well-
their husbands and stuff.
Well, I'd learn about things, but anyway, so we'd go to the national parks. What was really fun is that we'd have this long caravan, and some of the ladies, that were mature, they weren't really fast drivers. They were cautious drivers, right? They weren't really fast, but they kind of trusted me. And so, they'd kind of keep up with the crowd because they didn't want to split up. So they got really good at driving after about 10 hours. But we'd start driving up the passes through Yellowstone, and we'd get behind an old truck that just was really going to slow everything down. So I would caution, the person behind me would have a CB2. And I would caution that person and say, okay, I'm going to pass this truck and see how far up, we can go and pass this truck on blind curves. And so what I would do is I would, and this would be a little tiny road going up there, and I'd go, okay, it's all clear, and all these cars would pass this old truck on blind curves all the way through.
Sounds like the wild world.
I know, but it was, you could see this, these old guys in a camper sitting there, like, "Grrr," and all these old ladies are passing them up with, on blind curves, it's like, you could see they were just freaking out. So anyway, so when I'm setting up a composition, it's like, either if I'm sitting at home, I still follow those rules, the center focal point and eye magnets, all that stuff, and that's all the stuff that we repeat over and over and over again. And why do we repeat it? Because I can say this stuff over and over and over again, and all of a sudden Molly goes, you never said that before, and I go, I think I have, but it's the first time she's heard it. I've had students that listen to my stuff and they'll go, what do you mean that? And everybody in the class will throw paints at them because it's like they've heard it for 5 years, so it's like, that's why you repeat it. And I have students that have been with me for 10 years. And I'll go, where's your eye magnets? Where's your checkering? Where's this? And they go, oh, God. It doesn't do any good to write it down because nobody ever looks at their notes anyway. Whether you're doing watercolor, whether you're doing oils, whether you're doing pastels, it's all the same thing. It's all the same thing. When it comes to the structure of the painting, you've got to have these things. And to be able to have the confidence when you're doing a watercolor to go in with your darks is amazing. My students' paintings go from kind of chalky watercolors to these rich, luscious watercolors. And they look like oil paints. In fact, when I look at them, I go, oh my God, is that a watercolor? That's how rich they get. And when they start off with me, they're these little mousy things like that. But it's like, you want that volume of color. You're not going to get there by putting layer and layer and layer, because eventually the paper just says no more.
And now that layer is kind of like when you're painting your oil paints, and you use the warm color, and then you use a light yellow, and then you use the dark yellow, and you keep switching back and forth till you get mud.
Mm-hmm.
And you get mud real fast on watercolor. And I think it's because you put a layer down, like one color, kind of laying everything. And then when you try to get the bright colors, you need that white paper behind you.
Yeah, well, that's what I said. There's nothing more luscious than taking a burnt sienna and laying it full on onto white paper. That color is as beautiful as anything you could possibly do.
Or if you want a cadmium red and you lay it over a burnt sienna, it's not going to be bright.
No. So there's a few little mind games that you play, but it is not the thing. And like I said, if you go to an art show, you'll see lots of wonderful pastels, lots of wonderful watercolors. And it isn't because everybody in that area just hangs out with watercolors. It's because they're relatively kind of easy. And when I have students that come in to class, I'll say, are you interested in oils? They go, oh, no, I would do watercolors. Oils are just too hard. And it's like, yeah, oils are hard. They're hard, but they also, so is playing the piano. You know, playing the piano is hard. The flute is easier. Because a flute, you have one note. Piano, you have 10 notes at one time. You know, but... And your feet, yes. And that goes into another conversation that I actually wanted to talk about today. Being connected with your subject matter and when not you have artistic license. Because one of my students today, a couple of my students today were talking about these things. And they're like, oh, you know, I watch these people do plein air painting. And they just kind of swish and dawdle and swish. And so, oh, it's so pretty. And it doesn't really look like the picture there, and then the pictures that they show me are kind of that little mousy little, you know, stuff like that. And they're like, why doesn't mine look like theirs? And they're not trying so hard to try to paint what they see. And I go, well, you know, if first you have to paint what you see. You have to know what that is. You have to be responsible for that. And I said that really a great painter like Richard Schmidt or some of the other artists that are really great at doing it, and I told this to her, I said, they really paint what they see. I mean, almost like a religion. And she goes, well, I saw a lot of Richard's paintings, and his paintings look more interpretive. And I said, yeah, but he is painting what he sees. He may opt to use a palette knife. He may have other decision making, but there's no doubt that the characteristics of what he's looking at is being reproduced. And you have to actually be that literal. Now, if you're playing the piano, you get a piece from Mozart. And you have to be responsible to play that piece of music the way Mozart wrote it. These are your notes. Moonlight Sonata, Beethoven, da 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 da. That's where his notes are. So where does the interpretive come in there? It comes in between the notes. It comes on how the notes are applied. Here are your notes. Da 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 da. Okay. So you have to play that song the way that the composer wrote it. Well, you have spaces in between the notes that are just 1/100th of a second. And during that 1/100th of a second, you have a little room to adjust to see how, you know, where you want to play that note. You also have the choice to either hit the note harder or softer, or come up to the note or not. The little moments that you turn that song into yours is in between the things that are written. That's your artistic license. And when you get kind of good, you can adjust that song a little bit to make it kind of yours, kind of make it like Liberace, and you're still, but the thing is, you can't change the song. When you hear Liberace play Mac the Knife, it's still dun 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 dun. But then in between all that, he throws in a little, yeah. Oh, that jumbo. See, but the thing is, those notes still have to be played right on. And it's the same thing when you paint. You have to paint that painting the way it is. Value, temperature, color, whatever you see on there has to be on your painting. But you can opt to put it on with your nose if you wanted to, or your finger. You can opt to put it on with a palette knife. You can opt to use a big brush or small brush. How you put the paint on, you can blur the edges a bit. You can have some transition in that color. But ultimately, that area, that thing, we were looking at trees, but those little areas of trees, if you're going to do dapple lighting, those areas have to be relatively close to what you're working on. And when you're sitting there watching plein air painters do that, they're actually still mimicking what it is that they're seeing, but they're interpreting it, but their interpretation is still around that base that they're looking at.
So the balance, I've always heard learn to see when you paint. You learn to see. But then when you paint what you see is something different than what somebody else sees.
Well, that's your experience, yeah. Well, the thing is, if I held a red ball here, everybody would agree it was a red ball. Everybody would kind of see it. How we would interpret it would be entirely different. And even our method, but ultimately the goal would still be a red ball. And so whether you chose to do it with a palette knife or to use your finger or however you wanted to do it, that'd be part of your interpretation. But you wouldn't start to making that ball into a square. And you wouldn't change it to green. And so a lot of people think, oh, well, I'm just going to, by gosh, by golly, do this and this and this. And you can eventually get to that point, but you kind of have to have a lot of experience before you manipulate it. So that gets us back to the conversation about doing your central focal point and understanding what it is that we're looking at as a whole. So if we're looking at a painting and we want a central focal point in an area, if you know how to do a central focal point, if you know how to make a light source, you know how to bring light source into a painting, then you can do that. But you can't make that up when you don't know what to do. And if you don't know the colors, what happens to colors goes into shadow, if you don't know how to get to color, what happens to color when it goes into light, you're kind of stuck. There are people who've been painting for years that can't get away from a photograph because they don't know what to do with it. And they just mindlessly kind of copy a photograph. And this is where the problem is with painting from photographs, is that you never learn your interpretation. And that interpretation, when you see that red ball, if you sit there and I want to do that with a palette knife and I want to work with it, when you're working from life, you kind of play in those options. But once you take a photograph, that red ball becomes a flat sphere. And you no longer feel like you have the options anymore to change. And so you end up just kind of copying, and that's where everything gets really photographic. The thing is, I have students, because you guys are starting to do the in-class stuff, which you guys are just rocking and rolling on. But you're doing that in just an hour and a half. But when you guys started in here, everybody in that, working with the real still lifes, were like stumbling and falling and really having issues with it. But you all are starting to get pretty good at it. You're getting practice. Say, oh, well, let's just take a picture and paint from a picture. All of a sudden it's like, oh, it just doesn't feel like the same. You know, it's not the same kind of thing. Plein air painting is hugely more complicated than painting a still life or even a portrait. Now, granted, there's some skills to doing a portrait, and there's some really great portrait artists.
Yeah.
And Richard Schmidt's one of them. But there's some skills. But to step outside and paint, whether you paint in watercolors or pastels or oils or acrylics, it's the final product that really counts anyway. It doesn't really matter how you attempt it. It's just that I invite you to try oils if you're a watercolorist. Every artist that you can possibly imagine is an imposter anyway, because all you ever see is the good stuff.
Yeah.
But every artist in the world has what you have in your garage, a bunch of crap.
Yeah.
You can look at the price points too. Oil paintings demand a lot more higher price than watercolors. I wouldn't say that they necessarily are worth more, but they perceive, like I said, we don't go to Europe to go see the watercolors. And I think that's the way the world perceives. And watercolors have gotten really a lot more respect in the last 20 years than they used to be.
Don't watercolors fade easier though than our oils, more long lasting, more durable?
Yeah, I guess you could, but everything's so archival now that they should watch out. But then a lot of people in my classes, they go, well, oil paintings are so expensive to get framed and stuff. And I'm like going, oh my God, it's like watercolors are like a fortune. By the time you get the matting and stuff, it's like crazy.
Glass.
And then they're heavy and stuff. Yeah, it's like, so I think they're both equal. And I definitely want to say, huh?
You can get by with not framing in oil and still have it look great.
Yeah, but that's a whole nother, I'm going to have a long demo on framing. I promise I will do that. What the end result is not one is neither better than the other. And I think a beautiful watercolor definitely stands up, against a beautiful oil painting. So there's nothing, but I invite people who do watercolors to try oils. And I invite people who are oil painters to try watercolors, because both of those mediums have things to offer each other. And it doesn't hurt to master everything. I think if you're mastering in oils, I think to pick up a watercolor brush is not that difficult.
Yeah.
I think it's not a full start. So if Wenberg said that he spent his whole lifetime mastering oils, why would he want to take up watercolors? Because that would take another lifetime. And I would agree, if you would just stuck with watercolors, you probably could spend a whole lifetime doing that. But I think if you master oils, you can go into watercolors fairly easy. For a watercolorist like you are, it's much harder to go the other way around. You know, so I think that's an interesting perspective. Big portion of who I coach are watercolorists, and there's no secret that I love oils more than anything. Out of all of them, I prefer least acrylics. But I mean, so where's your central focal point? See that? See how she just sat there going?
Yeah.
This is where I would throw a Nerf ball at her. Because your center focal point has to be established at the very beginning. But see, that's not in the middle third. Center focal point should be in the middle third somewhere. Should be the brightest area of the painting. It should be the thing that has the most effect on it, meaning the light hitting it. Now, why did I ask you to do marbles? Well, with marbles you have the light, and I'm a stickler for light, right? You know, that's what so if I say I want a marble, it's like, you know, what does a marble look like? And it's got beautiful light effects and refractions and cast shadows. I mean, nothing more beautiful in a painting than a beautiful lit marble. So you almost feel like you had to put in all this stuff, you know, because marbles are so small. So you feel like, oh. But actually, if you would have just had a painting that was just a sheet of paper and a pencil on it, maybe a little writing on the paper, and then you just had one marble on there, and the light came through and hit that marble and threw that beautiful cast shadow on the paper, that would be just, the painting would be done. Because it had the lighting effect. We wouldn't have all that. So when you wow us with all of this other stuff, but how do you know not to do that? By doing that. I have a student up in Medford where for a year I'd go, get into it, get simpler, refine it, don't put so much stuff in. Just, you know, it's like you're working too hard. It's like she's finally gotten to the point where she's left everything out. And she just keeps with the facts. Looking at this, even if we just...
Oh, right out here.
Take it even more. So like this, by taking that, see? So even if you had all of your marbles, but you really concentrated on trying to get the light hitting that like that. Now the painting, it makes more sense. Because all of this in here is adding to the story. And it's like that makes it just work over there. But the problem is, when it's all lit up, it's just a big, uninteresting collage. And so if you take something really small and make it to do something, that is extraordinary. And when we see paintings in the museums, you'll have this really amazing big portrait and all this stuff. And then all of a sudden you look at the eye and it just looks like it's looking back at you. And it's got beautiful lighting. So you go, oh my God, such a beautiful painting. You don't need a lot to make things. In fact, things clutter the surface. And if you actually think about the painting that you did, you could leave a lot of those marbles just in shadow, which would be a lot easier because you don't have to repaint them. It's just circles, dark, flat circles. And then when you get towards the light, kind of a little more transparent. And then you just find one marble that you go. And when you can kiss the light like that and get your center focal point down to a little tiny spot on a large canvas, then that's extraordinary. That you really manipulate. When you start off a painting, you're not working from a photo. You kind of have to take a stab at it. And like right now, I'm doing a painting of an elk in front of a big waterfall. The elk's really close to you and he's trumpeting. He's like pissed off because you've entered his zone, his mecca. And last night I looked at it and said, oh my God, it's just too big for this little painting. And so I had to shrink him down, you know, to get him in there. The thing is, but it's an oil painting, I can just do that. If it were watercolor, I'd be screwed. because I had so much dark and everything in here. But the thing is, with an oil painting, the great thing about an oil painting is that the more layers you put on it, the more beautiful it becomes.
Yeah.
It's like, you know, in fact, it's even awesome to take a really crappy oil painting and paint another painting on top of it. And it's like the painting underneath adds to the finished product. You just make sure you scrape off all of the bumps and stuff. But it's like more layers and more layers and more layers, it gets more beautiful and more beautiful. But the thing is, there's a balance between negative and positive shapes. And this, you just got a little bit large. When you start off, and I was kind of watching you, and we had this conversation before, kind of start off with a much quicker preliminary drawing. You went in and really kind of drew that thing pretty like your life depended on it because you really liked it. Yeah, I could tell when a student likes it because they get into like, oh, I got to make sure it's right. But the problem with that is that it was too big and you didn't step back soon enough. And then once you kind of got all that commitment in your drawing, you don't want to change it anymore. So you need to commit less. It's kind of like going on a date. Your mom told you, now, don't sleep with them the first night. Go have some coffee and then go home and then think about it. Okay? You need to put something on and then think about it. But that's the lesson. You have to do that. You have to blow it to know it. You have to do, because while you're painting it, you're thinking, wow, this is going to be my best ever. I love this thing. And then you step back and you go, huh. But the thing is, you've got to do a dozen of these that are real, you know, and you go, oh, smart, you know, move it around. Your initial preliminary painting is a sketch color. It should be the exact color. So if we're doing alla prima painting, which is basically plein air painting but indoors, one setting, it's about getting the color right from the very beginning. This is why I liked Ursula's painting when she started putting that color in. I was like, shut up, Stefan. Don't say anything. Because part of being a coach is knowing when to coach and when not. And so out of all of the stuff that she could do, she was nailing the color. And that was the one thing that you weren't doing, but you got good composition. So you want to make sure that you just sit there. Remember, in the early days, they painted from life because they didn't have photography. And artists that eventually went outdoors with their painting to do plein air painting, they did it because they needed to know what the world looked like so they got back to the studio, they could repaint it. It's always about honoring your subject matter at every point. This is where doing watercolor would be good for you because you can't paint everything brown and then expect it to go gray. But it's a thing painting. If you look at Sargent's paintings, they're not thing paintings, they're light paintings. Nobody gives a darn about who that person is. They want to see lights and shadows on things. And you got to remember that you only see the color of local color, the color of the flesh, what you're trying to get in transition. So you put local color all over it, it looks like she's a doll. Not a pretty doll, like, fake. I don't think she looks like a doll anyway, but now she looks like a fake doll. Like a blow-up doll. No. But the thing is, you have to have shadows, which are your warms. Now, your shadows have nothing to do. Your shadows have nothing to do with the color of the flesh. There's no color in flesh. In fact, there was an artist that said, make the ugliest, muddiest, ickiest color that you could possibly mix, and I'll use it for the shadow of Venus, and you'll swear that she has a porcelain face. The shadows have nothing to do with color and light and stuff. They're just there. Highlight colors have to do everything with the light source. If you change the light source and put a blue bulb in, you're going to have blue on the face. If you're going to have yellow light, blue light, green light, red light, you're going to get a bruise. But that color on there, that's the color of the light. So the only place that you see flesh color is in between the lights and shadows. So like you'll have the light hitting, the light hitting here and the shadow here. You'd only see actually the color like in between, like on the cheek, highlight here, transition, shadow, depending on how that falls.
That's really interesting you say that, Stefan, because Susan Graves was doing the portrait and the shadow color was really a gray, purple. I'm thinking, ooh, where's she going to go with that? But then when she was done, now I can see that.
Yeah. So it's just, you got to separate that. And then you got to think about planes. You know, you got a plane for the forehead. You got planes for the side of the head. Planes over here. Planes here. Planes here. Planes here. Planes here. And so when you start blending those planes away, it starts looking like a gigantic apple. So she kind of looks a little bit like those apples that they carve and then they dry out.
No. How you said that?
But I love it. She's so deep in thought, and she's such a gypsy. She could probably be my great grandmother or something like that. Did you know I was a gypsy? I just don't dress like one. I actually am. My mother, at one point in my life, she says, "I got to sit down and have a talk with you." And I go, "Why?" I thought she was going to say something awful. And she says, "Well, I want you to know that your great grandmother was a full-fledged, honest to God, living in the woods with carts and animals, gypsy." And I was like, "Oh, how cool." If you'd like to try coaching for yourself, whether you're a beginner or an advanced painter, please don't hesitate to give me a call at 415-606-9074. Join us on our website at www.thegrandview.org and get more information about our show. There you can download our free book, Everything You Need to Know About Outdoor Painting.